Take me back to the big sky. Take me back to the reasons why I'm lost without you. With you I'm fireproof. Take me back to your brighter side. Used to leave me captivated, but now I'm left waiting. Back and forth between the dreaming that we once created. Hiding out behind the walls, now you're keeping me locked out. Wait around for you to run out, don't leave me behind. Don't leave me behind. Take me back to the big sky. Take me back to the reasons why I'm lost without you. With you I'm fireproof. Take me back to your brighter side.
God of friendship, I come to know your love and care through the embodied presence of others. Weave me together with kindred spirits. Knit me more closely with friends of the soul. Cultivate in me a kinship with humanity, so that I recognize my struggles and joys in others. In my loneliness, reveal to me this communion, and may I be a solace to others who ache for connection. Transform me through conversation and loving presence. Help me to see how I am part of a great circle of pilgrims, witnesses, ancestors, and mystics who guide me to true connection with you. Gather me into your great wide heart, so I might discover I am never separate, but always held in love.
sovereign, clothed with goodness, dressed in strength. And so the world is firmly established, and it cannot be moved. You, addressed by the world's voice, are firmly established from the first, and before and after the first. The rivers have been lifted. The river's cries, the river's shouts have been lifted. The rivers have lifted their dark waves. But more than the thunder of the waters, more than the thumping of the seas, is you. Your witnessing is steadfast. Your house is ever whole, even past the end of time.
Come and listen to me. O Lord, hear my prayer. O Lord, hear my prayer. When I call, answer me. O Lord, hear my prayer. O Lord, hear my prayer. Come and listen to me. O Lord, hear my prayer. O Lord, hear my prayer. When I call, answer me. O Lord, hear my prayer. O Lord, hear my prayer. Come and listen to me. O Lord, hear my prayer. O Lord, hear my prayer. When I call, answer me. O Lord, hear my prayer. O Lord, hear my prayer. Come and listen to me. One final time. O Lord, hear my prayer. O Lord, hear my prayer. When I call, answer me. O Lord, hear my prayer. O Lord, hear my prayer. Come and listen to me.
Holy source of silence, beneath the clatter and din of the everyday, you offer your mysteries to our hearts. You call us to pause, to slow down, and listen to the true longing planted in each of us by you, a seed of holy desire. Support us in letting go of the inner and outer noise. Open wide in us a sacred cave for stillness, where we can attune to your presence. Enliven us with the gift of your sweet music, and allow us to encounter your holy presence flaming in each of our hearts. Help us to catch a note of your song in the wind or in the voice of another, in times of sadness and in the rush of our lives. In a world so filled with distraction, we listen for your whispers which call us to another way of being, and ask for the courage to respond to all we discover in this tabernacle of silence.
Pope Pius XI wrote an encyclical which established that tradition. Then it got picked up by Anglicans and Lutherans and eventually found its way into the liturgical calendar that we use on the final Sunday of what's called Ordinary Time. It's the last Sunday of the liturgical year. We'll start the year again next week with the first week of Advent. So on one hand, the encyclical was concerned with the waning cultural and political influence of the church a quarter of the way through the 20th century. But on the other, written in the aftermath of World War I, it was a call for unity, an assertion of the hope of a lasting peace, in which a vision of unity that transcended loyalties to political powers and asserted that the kingdom of God was greater than the political structures that had led to mass destruction. As I once heard my friend Stan Dotson back at my home church in North Carolina preach, throughout the biblical text and on through the history of the church, there have been two primary competing images of Christ, the one of the Good Shepherd and that of the benevolent king. The Good Shepherd draws on agrarian images and emphasizes a nurturing relationship with all of creation, while the king draws on metaphors of empire and socio-political order. Y'all might guess, you know me well enough by now, that I tend towards the shepherd motif. But I can really understand the appeal of Christ the King, particularly in the historical moment that this day kind of came out of, in which earthly kings and rulers had led to such devastation. Over the last century, the interpretation of Christ the King Sunday has strayed from the peace-building intent explicit in its context and moved towards something more eschatological, or meaning focusing on otherworldly end times and proclamations about the nature of the kingdom of heaven. But at least in part, the original emphasis was on a very here and now moment. Perhaps more than any other point in our liturgical calendar, which mostly emerges from ancient traditions of ritual and practice much older than 100 years ago, we can see here on Christ the King Sunday the specific and immediate circumstances that brought on this ritual celebration. And while I have some significant theological and political differences, perhaps from what Pius XI asserts, there is merit in considering this day through that particular intent, a call for peace and unity that is deeper than stitching together treaties, a view of the world that, for Christians at least, is bigger than flag-waving nationalism. So let's turn to the text for today and see what the gospel reading may have to teach us in that light. This comes from the Gospel according to John in the 18th chapter. Then Pilate entered the headquarters again, summoned Jesus, and asked him, "Are you king of the Jews?" Jesus answered, "Do you ask this on your own, or did others tell you about me?" Pilate replied, "I am not a Jew, am I? Your own nation and the chief priests have handed you over to me. What have you done?" Jesus answered, "My kingdom is not from this world. If my kingdom were from this world, my followers would be fighting to keep me from being handed over to the Jews. But as it is, my kingdom is not from here." Pilate asked him, "So you are a king?" Jesus answered, "You say that I'm a king. For this I was born, and for this I came into the world, to testify to the truth. Everyone who belongs to the truth listens to my voice." So while many commentators have focused on this text as an assertion of Jesus' authority, Latino American liberation theologian Samuel Cruz gives us another view. He writes, I have a different view of this passage as I simply see Jesus responding to a person with societal power from the perspective of the underside of history, which has a very different set of values than that of the dominant society. And maybe that's where the key lies for us. Not in trumping earthly rulers with a vision of authority that is I'm going to try that again. Not in trumping earthly rulers with a vision of authority that is rooted in earthly notions of empire, but of disrupting our very notions of where authority lies, as articulated by one who speaks from the margins, working class teacher on the fringes of an occupied territory subject to the whims of an agent of Rome. Y'all, I come from a place that thinks of itself as the most powerful country in the world. It's a country in which military might has been married with U.S. American exceptionalism, and God and country have merged into a toxic Christian nationalism propped up with an evangelical zeal that has impacted both domestic and global policy. Y'all already know that. I know we're not the only perpetrators of this particular sin. We didn't invent the God and country rhetoric, but we have elevated it and exploited it with such force that it's hard to think on these themes without speaking to the political realities of my home. As a young school teacher, fresh out of university, I was called into the principal's office, which happened more when I was a teacher than it ever did when I was a student. But this time it was because one of my students noticed that when we stood to say the Pledge of Allegiance to the flag each morning, yes, that is a thing that actually happens there, it's not just in the movies, I stood quietly in the back of the room and didn't place my hand over my heart. She told her parents, who called the school, and I was brought in for questioning. In a rural public school, supposedly subject to separation of church and state, but where many Christian teachers and students arrived early on Fridays to hold hands and pray around the flagpole before classes started, my choice to refrain from participation in the morning pledge marked me as suspicious. That my defense was based in a religious conviction was nearly incomprehensible. I love my country, but locating my allegiance in God and resisting seeing the United States as inherently the ultimate expression of God's will on earth was seen as pretty disruptive. That was more than a quarter century ago in the Clinton era. And given the culture wars that have ensued since, I can only imagine that my stance would even be more controversial now. I don't know if you've seen U.S. news, but stuff that's going on in school board meetings these days is pretty ugly. However, Jesus, as depicted in the Gospels, is not an agent of empire. Far from it. God enters the world not as a prince, but as the child of an unwed teen mother and blue-collar laborer. His life and ministry consistently call into question the perceived order. And even amongst his disciple, he's continually flipping the script on assumptions about hierarchical power. Christ the King is not about replacing earthly rulers with a new and better version. He's about rethinking the very system that raises up such rulers to begin with. And that's what's at the heart of today's gospel. The powerful keep hold of their privilege and their power by controlling the conversation. So Pilate's no exception in what he does here. Is Pilate asking honest and authentic questions, or does he already know the answers that he's looking for? Is Jesus responding with an assertion of his authority, or just answering honestly based on his experience as a marginalized individual? Or perhaps there's a third way. A third way to understand this text. Maybe Jesus' ultimate authority actually does rest precisely in his marginalization. Perhaps this is his primary witness and challenge to the very nature of the perceived world order. As Cruz interprets it, Jesus posed the questions, are you asking me sincerely, or are you prejudiced because what have people told you? Did you already make up your mind? In other words, Jesus called out Pilate for his feigned neutrality in their conversation. Pilate's question is one that he was asking for others, a question that was full of biases. Pilate wants to act as though he is innocent of his prejudiced notions about Jesus while playing along with the lies and corruption of his constituents. Jesus doesn't fall for it. He instead unmasks the demonic forces of his society that engage in such egregious abuse of power. So what's happening in this story is something like a police officer confronting and questioning a young black man standing innocently on a street corner. The assumption is that he must be up to something. If his very existence is deemed a problem, his responses matter little in determining his sentence. The supposed neutrality is a farce. So when Jesus responds to Pilate saying, my kingdom is not of this world, he is not meaning that his kingdom is somewhere in heaven and not relevant to this world. He is saying that the values of his kingdom are so radically different from those of the current system that they cannot be comprehended through the worldview of an earthly empire. The very system through which Pilate is given the power to choose whether or not Jesus will live or die. He's calling out Pilate's assumption of his guilt, exposing the prejudiced system of authority. And so this is where I differ from Pius XI, who in calling for unity and peace also sought to reassert the earthly power of the church. The values of Jesus' kingdom are so counter to earthly values that as Christians, we, like Pilate, often fail to comprehend them. The church is called to serve in humility, to speak not from the center, but from the margins, not to replace one empire with another. Jesus is a king that enters the city not in a chariot, but on a donkey. He's a man on the margins, assumed guilty by his very existence. Jesus is a king who surrounds himself with a traveling band of outsiders, not wealthy and influential power brokers. He's a man who rejects the accepted markers of status and privilege. Jesus is a king who doesn't defeat his adversaries in war, but is murdered at the hands of the state. And in so doing, and going to the cross, he's a man who calls out the fallacy of the powers that be. He bears witness to the radical power of love, a love that threatens the assumed order of things, that sees people as disposable props in a system that concentrates wealth and power in the hands of a few. And no matter how hard, how violently they try to kill that love, it just will not die. Resurrection happens. We serve a king who does not seek power and glory, but rather calls us to humble service for the greater good. In contrast to the dominant win-at-all-cost values that still permeate our political culture, we serve a crucified God. The values of that kingdom are radically different and stand in such stark contrast to the values of the world that even utilizing the metaphor of king only functions ironically. And I like a bit of irony. So let's keep Christ the King, but know in our hearts that when we do so, it's a bit of a satire. The values of Christ the Shepherd make clear that those who seek power and prestige at the cost of others reject the very kingdom they purport to be living into. So this Christ the King Sunday offers an opportunity for us as the church, the living body of the crucified God resurrected in the world, to consider our values and evaluate how we operate in our society. Are we on mission? Do our practices point us in the direction Jesus intends for us? If not, let us correct our course so that we may truly be the church that our world so desperately needs. The one that clings, not the one that clings to relevance by marrying itself to political power. So let's not grieve the secularization of the world, but rather let's take advantage of a shifting culture to claim our place on the margins where we belong, where we were born, from which Jesus comes, following Jesus and standing in solidarity with the dispossessed and the powerless as we speak truth to power. For this I was born, says our shepherd king. And for this I came into the world to testify to the truth. So when we commit ourselves to climate justice, when we call for reproductive justice, when we do the work of achieving racial justice, when we question the allegiance the nation state demands of us, when we stand on the side of the poor, when we refuse to take up arms and instead enter into the way of the cross, only then can we speak with the authority of servants to Christ the King. With our tongues planted firmly in our cheeks.
Thanks for that, Brian. We're going to come to an end of our service today with singing, and then we've got a little closing reflection. So I'm going to ask the musicians to come on up, take their places. As they do so, the closing song, it's an older one, My Jesus, My Savior, and all our stories, our journeys involve different interactions with God through Jesus and what that has meant to us. And perhaps today, as we stand and sing these words, we can reflect for ourselves, what does it really mean? Honestly, what does it really mean to hold Christ as King for us today in the midst of our world and our culture? So let's stand together and sing.
Shout to the Lord on the earth, let us sing. Power and majesty, praise to the King. Mountains bow down and the seas will roar at the sound of your name. I sing for joy at the work of your hands. Forever I'll love you, forever I'll stand. Nothing compares to the promise I have in you. will roar at the sound of your name. I sing for joy at the work of your hands. Forever I'll love you, forever I'll stand. Nothing compares to the promise I have, and nothing compares to the promise I have, and nothing compares to the promise I have in you.
Time to let it go, it won't let go of me. Hanging by a thread, cutting the cord and then falling back into the black. Cause if I don't, if I wait till it feels right, I'll be waiting my whole life. Closing my eyes, remember how we were like gold when you see me high. If you need me, babe, that's the way it was. That's the history blue. How we used to roar like an open fire. That's the way it was, but that's history. That's the way it was, but that's history. That's the way it was, but that's history. I have a memory. You're visiting me at night, climbing in my bed. You were so quiet that you never woke me. I love the way you could see the good in everything. But do we feel the fire? Closing my eyes, remember how we were like gold when you see me high. If you need me, babe, that's the way it was. That's the history blue. How we used to roar like an open fire. That's the way it was, but that's history. Started with a word. Now look at where we are, everything we've done is there on our faces for anyone willing to read between the lines. Now look at where we are, everything we've done is there on our faces for anyone willing to. That's the way it was, but that's history. That's the way it was, but that's history. Well, I got a feeling, darling, it's possible that this love's got no ceiling now, and it's just so strong. And I got a feeling like everything is possible. I'm trying to change. Oh, when you see me high, if you need me, babe, that's the way it was. That's the history blue. How we used to roar like an open fire. That's the way it was, but that's history. Started with a word. Now look at where we are, everything we've done is there on our faces for anyone willing to read between the lines. Now look at where we are, everything we've done, starting out with just one. Hold when you see me high. If you need me, babe, that's the way it was, but that's history.
Your love is a flood, and I swim deep when the tide is up. Oh, would you flood me too? So water in my blood has made me taste sweet to the world. Oh, and you taste sweet too. This is my deliverance, hands held high as you deliver it. Oh, you have made me a child of God, my feet on the ground, my heart in heaven. I am bread made without the living. Oh, you have made me a child of God. Well, I lay in the sand with sweet forgiveness in my hand. Oh,
my deliverance, hands held high, as you deliver it. Oh, you have made me a child of God, my feet on the ground, my heart in heaven. I am bread made without the living. Oh, you have made me a child.